The owner would rather burn down the family business than admit a woman knew better. When Silas first told me about his family's company, he described it like a living thing. Old, stubborn, and slowly suffocating under its own weight. It had been around for over 50 years, founded by his grandfather, passed down to his father, and now barely hanging on by habit alone. The kind of place that survived on reputation rather than results. The kind of place people whispered about in the past tense. On paper, the company should not have been failing. The product was solid, the location was excellent, and the client base was loyal but shrinking, like a glacier melting 1 degree at a time. The real issue was invisible to customers and painfully obvious to anyone who had worked in modern business within the last decade. The owner. Silas's father, Harold, was 72 years old and ran the company exactly the way he had in 1989. He used the same vendors, the same accounting practices, the same management structure, and held the same assumptions about authority, hierarchy, and who was naturally suited to leadership. That last assumption was where I came in. I had spent 10 years climbing through operations management and restructuring roles. I specialized in walking into businesses that were hemorrhaging money and diagnosing problems no one wanted to admit existed. I didn't fix things with charisma or speeches. I fixed them with systems, data, and uncomfortable truths. Silas knew that. That was why he asked me to take a look. He didn't ask his father. He asked me. At first, I treated it like a consulting favor. A few spreadsheets, some workflow observations, and a polite report that could be passed along and probably ignored. But the deeper I looked, the worse it got. Inventory mismanagement alone was costing them tens of thousands a month. Employee turnover was disguised as retirement and seasonal adjustment. Marketing was almost non-existent, relying on word of mouth from customers who were aging out faster than replacements came in. Their competitors had modernized quietly and completely. When Silas finally convinced his father to let me come in temporarily, Harold framed it as a courtesy. He said he was humoring his son and that it was good for me to see how a real business worked. He never said my name without emphasizing it, like it needed explanation. Every time he said it, it came with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. From day one, I was treated like an intern with a clipboard. I wasn't given access to the full financials. I wasn't introduced as a consultant. I wasn't looped into management meetings unless Silas physically walked me into the room. Harold spoke over me without raising his voice. He dismissed my questions as curiosity and reframed my observations as a fresh perspective in the same tone someone might use for a child pointing out a spelling mistake. I documented everything anyway. I stayed late. I watched workflows from a distance. I talked to employees in the margins of their day. Every problem traced back to Harold's control. There was no delegation and no accountability below him. Decisions. Bottlenecked at the top, then delayed by indecision disguised as tradition. He didn't trust any software he couldn't physically touch. He refused to adjust pricing because he had always known what things were worth. He did not trust women with authority. That part became clear quickly. He assigned male supervisors to relay information to me. He asked Silas questions after I presented findings. When I corrected numbers, he double-checked them publicly. When a man repeated the same conclusion 2 weeks later, Harold praised his insight. I stopped pushing verbally. Instead, I started building proof. By the end of the first month, I had a comprehensive restructuring plan. It wasn't radical or flashy. It was practical, incremental, and measurable. A plan that could stabilize cash flow in 6 months and modernize operations in 18. Silas believed in it completely. Harold glanced at it once and set it aside. He said the business didn't need saving, it needed loyalty. That was when I realized this wasn't about competence. It was about ownership. And Harold would rather lose everything than admit someone like me could run what he built better than he could. I didn't quit when Harold dismissed the plan. Instead, I adjusted. If I couldn't change the business directly, I would let the business reveal itself. I asked for permission to observe operations more closely. Harold agreed because observation didn't threaten him. Watching wasn't leading and listening wasn't deciding. He treated it like harmless busy work. What he didn't realize was that observation was my strongest tool. I tracked missed deadlines, logged equipment downtime, and recorded how often decisions stalled because Harold wasn't available or didn't want to commit. I measured employee productivity against outdated processes and compared it to industry benchmarks. The numbers were brutal. Revenue loss was predictable, waste was systemic, and risk exposure was growing in areas Harold didn't even understand, like compliance changes he waved off as temporary trends. Silas watched me work with a mix of pride and quiet dread. He knew his father was walking the company toward a cliff. He also knew confronting him directly would only harden his resistance. Harold mistook my silence for submission. He began assigning me smaller, insulting tasks, reviewing filing systems, sitting in on meetings without speaking, and shadowing managers who barely understood their own roles. I accepted all of it because every task gave me more access. Every access point gave me more data, and every piece of data strengthened the case Harold refused to hear. The employees noticed in subtle ways. They started asking me questions when supervisors weren't around. They started forwarding emails, instead of summarizing them and copying me on messages that had never included me before. They trusted me because I listened and because I didn't blame them for systems that failed them. Harold noticed too. His attitude shifted from dismissive to irritated. He began correcting me preemptively. He questioned why employees seemed confused. Lately, he accused Silas of undermining authority simply by supporting me. The tension thickened the air. Still, I didn't argue. I let the quarter close, and when the financials came in, they were worse than projected. Not catastrophic, just undeniably worse. Harold blamed external factors. I built a side-by-side comparison showing that competitors in the same region had grown. Harold said the data was misleading. I showed him internal inefficiencies quantified. In dollars, he said numbers didn't tell the whole story. I showed him employee churn trends tied directly to management decisions. He said loyalty mattered more than comfort. At no point did he deny the facts. He simply rejected the conclusion. That was when Silas finally stepped in. Silas was a minority owner, a stake Harold had granted years ago as a symbolic gesture, never expecting it to matter, but now it did. At least it mattered enough to request a formal review. It mattered enough to involve external auditors and to force transparency Harold had avoided for years. Harold reacted exactly as expected. He accused me of manipulation and implied ambition where there was professionalism. He framed my work as overreach and my presence as intrusion. He never once criticized my competence directly. Instead, he questioned my place. The review took 3 months. By the end of it, the truth stood without my voice. The company was failing because it refused to evolve. Harold was offered options: retire with dignity, transition leadership, and accept an operational head with authority. He chose none of them. He tried to push me out. What he didn't realize was that by then, the board trusted me more than him. The employees respected me more than they feared him. The numbers spoke louder than his legacy. When the final decision came down, it wasn't dramatic. Harold was removed from day-to-day control. Silas didn't celebrate. I didn't either because winning didn't feel like victory. It felt like rescue. Harold's removal from day-to-day control didn't end his presence. He still came into the office every morning at the same time. He still parked in the same spot. He still walked the floor with the slow confidence of someone who believed authority lingered simply because it once existed. On paper, his role had been reduced to advisory. In reality, he treated the change like a temporary inconvenience that would correct itself if he waited long enough. I was appointed interim operations director. The title alone seemed to offend him more than any data ever had. I didn't move into his old office or touch his furniture. I worked from a converted conference room with glass walls and a desk that faced the rest of the building. Visibility mattered, not symbolically, but practically. I wanted people to see that nothing secretive was happening and that leadership didn't require isolation. The first few weeks were calm in a way that felt artificial. Processes changed quietly, approval chains shortened, and software updates rolled out without ceremony. Employees adapted faster than anyone had expected, and productivity rose in small, undeniable increments. Harold watched all of it like a man, waiting for a mistake. He began undermining in ways that were subtle enough to be plausible. He told long-term employees that my changes were temporary experiments. He hinted that the board would come to its senses and advised managers to keep records in case things needed to be reversed. He framed himself as a stabilizing presence while positioning me as a disruption. The worst part was that none of it violated policy. Employees were caught between respecting a legacy and following current leadership. Some froze, some tried to please both sides, and a few quietly resisted change, not out of malice, but confusion. I documented everything. When Harold gave unauthorized instructions, I logged the impact. When confusion delayed decisions, I recorded the cost. When employees hesitated because they feared contradicting him, I noted the operational drag. I didn't confront him. I just let patterns form naturally. Silas struggled more than I did. This was still his father. He carried the weight of history, obligation, and guilt in ways I never would. I saw it in his posture, the way his shoulders tightened whenever Harold entered a room. I saw it in the restraint he used when the situation deserved firmness. I compensated by being immovable. Then Harold escalated. He contacted vendors directly and attempted to renegotiate contracts without authority. He framed it as relationship maintenance. The vendors, confused but respectful, looped me in. He reassigned an employee who had been critical to a new workflow, setting a department back weeks. He claimed it was a favor. He leaked selective information to an industry contact, implying internal instability. The rumor didn't damage us externally, but it shook employee confidence internally. That was the moment the board stopped seeing this as resistance. They began calling it interference. The next review meeting was closed door. Harold was not invited. For the first time since I'd met him, he was excluded from something that mattered. He filed a formal complaint against me. Not for incompetence, for conduct. He alleged that I had overstepped boundaries, manipulated reporting, and leveraged personal relationships, specifically my relationship with Silas, to gain authority. He didn't use inflammatory language. He used professional phrasing that implied impropriety without stating it outright. It was calculated and deeply revealing. The investigation that followed was exhaustive. Everything I had carefully preserved became my shield. The complaint collapsed under its own weight. There was no misconduct, manipulation, or favoritism. What there was a documented pattern of obstruction by Harold. The board's tone changed. They stopped discussing transition and started discussing removal. When the final decision was made, it wasn't delivered by me. It was delivered by silence. Harold was stripped of his advisory role, his access was revoked, and his presence was reduced to that of a shareholder with no operational authority. He stopped coming in, and the building felt lighter, but the damage wasn't undone overnight. Trust takes longer to rebuild than systems, and the most dangerous problems aren't the loud ones. They're the ones that linger quietly, waiting for space to grow. With Harold fully removed, the company entered a phase I hadn't anticipated. Grief, not mine, and not Silas's. The employees. For decades, Harold had been a constant. Flawed, controlling, and outdated but familiar. His absence left a vacuum that wasn't just procedural, it was emotional. People had oriented their careers around him, even when it hurt them. I didn't rush that process. I didn't brand the changes as victories. I focused on stability, clear expectations, transparent metrics, and predictable decision-making. I held open reviews where data replaced opinion. I encouraged written feedback without retaliation, and I made sure credit traveled downward instead of upward. Slowly, confidence returned. Productivity didn't spike dramatically, it stabilized, which was far more important. Revenue followed, then something unexpected happened. Former employees began reaching out. People who had left quietly over the years and those who had cited personal reasons and new opportunities. They asked about openings and if things were really different now. Some of them came back. That was the first sign that the culture had truly shifted. Silas stepped into a more formal leadership role during this period, not as a figurehead but as a partner. He trusted my judgment publicly and privately. He backed decisions without theatrics and learned where his strengths were and where mine carried more weight. The company began to resemble something sustainable. Then Harold resurfaced. Not in the office, in court. He filed a lawsuit claiming wrongful removal, breach of fiduciary duty, and reputational damage. The filing was extensive and aggressively detailed. It reframed every corrective action as personal vendetta, every documented failure as selective interpretation. It was the final attempt to assert control. The case dragged on for months. Depositions replaced meetings, and legal language replaced operational language. Progress slowed, not because we regressed, but because attention was divided. I remained calm because lawsuits rely on narrative and I had documentation. Every claim was met with records and every allegation answered with timelines. Every emotional appeal was countered with evidence. The court didn't need to decide who was right. It needed to decide what was true. The case was dismissed before trial. Harold's final leverage evaporated quietly, the way most power does when it's built on assumption rather than structure. After that, he disappeared entirely. The company didn't celebrate the dismissal, it simply moved forward. We expanded into new markets cautiously. We upgraded equipment responsibly and promoted from within. We replaced fear with predictability. 2. Years later, the business was profitable in ways it had never been before. Not because it was larger, but because it was healthier. The months following Harold's disappearance from the company's daily life were both surprisingly calm and subtly chaotic, like standing on solid ground that still trembles underfoot. And I found myself navigating a landscape that was far more fragile than it appeared. Not because of the business itself, but because of the memories, habits, and long-ingrained fears that had been baked into every department, every workflow, and every interaction over decades of his control. Employees were tentative at first, unsure how to respond to authority that no longer came with the shadow of intimidation. Even those who had openly supported the transition were quietly testing the boundaries, learning to trust that decisions made would hold, that directives would be followed consistently, and that their own contributions would be recognized based on merit rather than whether they knew how to please the man who had loomed over them for half their careers. I structured everything carefully, not in the bold strokes of radical overhaul, but in a meticulous layering of improvements. Meetings were designed to share information clearly without micromanagement. Approval chains were shortened but documented. To maintain accountability, and expectations were defined and repeated in ways that were impossible to misinterpret or manipulate. It left little room for the kind of quiet sabotage or passive resistance Harold had once relied upon to assert his invisible authority. Silas observed the process with a quiet determination that surprised me, not because I doubted his abilities, but because I had expected him to struggle under the weight of loyalty and resentment toward a father who had simultaneously shaped his life and obstructed it. However, he adapted with remarkable subtlety, intervening only when necessary and trusting me to lead without his constant validation. It was a balance that required restraint far greater than anything I could have demanded of him. The employees began to notice the shift, not in dramatic moments, but in small, accumulative changes. They saw the way approvals happened faster, how feedback was acted upon transparently, and the way mistakes were treated as opportunities to improve systems rather than occasions to assign blame. Over time, tentative respect evolved into quiet confidence, with productivity increasing almost imperceptibly at first, then in a steady and undeniable trend that could no longer be attributed to chance or external conditions. By the time the lawsuit case closed, Harold had disappeared almost completely from the professional sphere, leaving the company to stabilize, rebuild, and in a way that felt almost miraculous after years of stagnation. The company thrived without the looming presence of resistance that had defined its previous decades. We were no longer merely surviving. We were progressing, expanding into new markets with deliberate caution, and promoting individuals who demonstrated aptitude and initiative. It was a process that replaced fear with competence as the defining metric for advancement. The company's financials improved, not in sudden, flashy surges, but in steady, predictable increments. The culture transformed in a way that was almost imperceptible. One morning, I realized that the office felt lighter, more open, and more energized, as though decades of unseen resistance had finally been removed and replaced by a structure that encouraged effort and rewarded insight regardless of age, gender, or historical entitlement. By the time 2 years had passed since I had first stepped into the building as an analyst sent to observe, the company had transformed in ways that were both profound and quietly satisfying. The sense of accomplishment I felt was not rooted in personal triumph, but in the restoration of a system that had been suffocating under outdated authority for decades. The offices were still the same physically, the desks, the walls, the floors unchanged, but everything else was unrecognizable from the days when a single voice had dictated outcomes not on merit, but on habit, pride, and the assumption of unquestionable expertise. Employees moved confidently through their tasks. Managers coordinated efficiently without needing daily supervision, and every department communicated in ways that were deliberate, consistent, and documented. We created a network of accountability that made the company resilient in a way it had never been before. Silas had assumed a leadership role that complemented mine, balancing oversight with discretion. He mentored teams while trusting me to implement systemic improvements without interference. In doing so, he finally achieved the equilibrium between authority and collaboration that Harold had never understood. Demonstrating quietly, through steady action rather than dramatic gestures, that effective leadership was not about asserting dominance, but about enabling others to contribute to a collective vision while ensuring that operational structures supported both efficiency and accountability. I watched the progress unfold with a mixture of relief and awe, knowing that my role was not to dominate and to let the business evolve into an entity capable of sustaining itself without relying on fear, authority, or outdated pride. In that process, the satisfaction I felt was compounded not by the absence of Harold, who had finally vanished entirely, but by the knowledge that every decision, every improvement, and every cautious risk we took had been validated by the transformation itself. The company reached stability not as a monument to conquest, but as a testament to resilience. In that quiet victory, I found a profound sense of closure. Harold had been the obstacle, Silas had been the ally, and I had been the instrument of transformation. Yet the ultimate reward was not personal triumph, but the living proof that a system could flourish in ways that were deliberate, structured, and enduring. I knew I was leaving behind not only financial growth, but a culture that respected knowledge, encouraged initiative, and most importantly, no longer feared the future because it could finally be guided intelligently, thoughtfully, and without the shadow of unearned authority looming over it. And in that realization, standing in the light-filled conference room that had once felt like a shadowed prison of outdated habits, I understood that some victories are silent, some triumphs are slow, and some wars are won not with confrontation, but with patience, strategy, and the unwavering belief that systems, when guided by clarity and competence, can outlast fear, pride, and even the most entrenched resistance.